The icy wind sliced through the evening air, rattling the streetlights and sending bits of trash tumbling down the sidewalk. Jalen pulled his thin hoodie tighter around his shoulders, but it did little to keep out the cold. His breath curled in white clouds before him as he stood outside the corner store, shifting his weight from foot to foot. The scent of fried chicken and warm bread drifted through the cracked door every time someone walked in or out, making his stomach tighten with hunger. He had been staring at the neon sign for the last 5 minutes, debating whether to go inside. He had exactly $1 in his pocket. It was supposed to be his bus fare home, but he was starving. His mom wouldn't have dinner ready until much later, and his stomach had been growling since lunch. A bag of chips wouldn't be much, but it would be something. His fingers curled around the crumpled bill in his pocket. He had found it under the couch that morning, a lucky break, or so he thought. Now, standing outside the store, he hesitated. If he spent it, he'd have to walk 5 miles home in the cold. If he kept it, he'd be hungry all night. A sudden commotion at the entrance snapped him out of his thoughts. The glass door swung open hard enough to make the bell above it jingle wildly. A man stumbled out, nearly falling onto the pavement. He was thin, his clothes hanging off him like they were meant for someone twice his size. His face was gaunt, shadowed with exhaustion and something else, something raw and desperate. Jalen took a step back instinctively. The man rubbed his hands over his face, muttering under his breath. He glanced around, eyes darting from person to person, but no one looked at him. People passed by quickly, avoiding eye contact, pretending not to see him. Then he spoke. His voice was rough, as if his throat had been scraped raw from too many cigarettes or not enough water. "Please, man. Just $1. Jalen stiffened. The man was asking a group of people near the store entrance, but they ignored him. One woman clutched her purse tighter and walked faster. A man in a business suit shook his head without looking up from his phone. The desperation in the man's eyes deepened. Jalen's fingers brushed over the $1 in his pocket. It wasn't much, but for this man it might mean more than just food. It might mean survival. He swallowed hard, glancing at the store again. His stomach protested, a sharp ache reminding him of his own hunger. He could pretend he didn't hear the man. He could walk inside, buy his chips, and forget about it. Or, Jalen exhaled slowly and stepped forward. The man hadn't even noticed him yet, too busy scanning the crowd for another possible handout. Jalen hesitated for only a second before pulling out the $1 and holding it out. "Here," he said quietly. The man's eyes flicked down to the bill, then up to Jalen's face. For a moment he didn't move, as if he thought it was a trick. "You serious?" Jalen nodded. The man took the bill with a shaky hand, his fingers brushing against Jalen's for half a second. His lips parted, but no words came out. His expression was unreadable, some mix of disbelief, gratitude, and something deeper, something Jalen couldn't quite place. "Why?" the man asked, his voice hoarse. Jalen shrugged, shifting on his feet. "You need it more than me." The man swallowed hard. For a second, Jalen thought he saw his eyes glisten under the dim streetlight, but then the man turned away, shoving the bill into his pocket. He muttered something under his breath, maybe a thank you, maybe not, and walked off into the night. Jalen watched him go, an uneasy feeling settling in his chest. He wasn't sure what he had expected. Maybe a bigger reaction. Maybe some kind of closure. Instead, he was left standing there, cold, broke, and still hungry. Then reality hit. His bus. His stomach dropped. He turned sharply toward the street, just in time to see the tail lights of the last bus disappearing down the road. His hands clenched into fists. He could have made it if he hadn't hesitated, if he hadn't wasted time thinking about that man. Now he was stuck. 5 miles to walk home in the freezing cold. Regret crawled up his spine. Had he made a mistake? He shook his head quickly. No, it wasn't a mistake. He had done the right thing. At least, that's what he told himself as he shoved his hands into his pockets and started walking. Each step felt heavier than the last. The streets grew quieter as he left the store behind, the sounds of the city fading into the distant hum of traffic. He pulled his hoodie tighter, but the wind still cut through like a blade. His fingers were already going numb. By the time he reached his apartment complex, his legs ached, and his face felt frozen. He climbed the stairs sluggishly, pushing open the door to their tiny apartment. The smell of rice and beans filled the air, a warm contrast to the night outside. His mother turned from the stove, her eyes narrowing when she saw him. "You're late, Jalen. What happened?" He hesitated for half a second before shaking his head. "Nothing. Just missed the bus." His mother sighed, stirring the pot with slow, methodical movements. "You know we don't have money for you to be missing buses. Every dollar counts." "I know," he muttered, sitting at the table. He stared at his hands, the phantom feel of the dollar bill still lingering between his fingers. His mother didn't push further. Instead, she ladled rice onto a plate and set it in front of him. "Eat," she said, before turning back to the stove. Jalen picked up his fork but didn't start right away. His mind was still outside, still back at the store, still thinking about the man. Who was he? Where did he go? What was his story? Would Jalen ever see him again? He didn't have an answer. But deep down, something told him this wasn't the last time their paths would cross. The diner smelled like burnt coffee and fried bacon. The neon sign outside flickered every few seconds, casting faint blue and red flashes over the cracked tiles of the floor. Jalen sat in the corner booth, his textbooks spread out in front of him, but his eyes weren't on the pages. They were on the bill in his hand, the one that had been sitting at the bottom of his backpack for weeks now. Past due. Again. His tuition deadline was creeping up like a shadow, and no matter how hard he worked, no matter how many shifts he picked up, it was never enough. He ran a hand over his face and exhaled slowly. The weight of it all pressed against his chest. College had always been the dream, the thing his mother had worked herself to exhaustion for. But now, with every passing day, it felt like a dream slipping through his fingers. The numbers on the bill blurred as his vision unfocused. He needed a miracle. The door to the diner swung open with a sharp jingle. Jalen barely looked up. He didn't care. Just another customer, just another person who wasn't going to change the reality of his situation. The footsteps were sharp against the tile, deliberate. He heard them pause, then move directly toward him. Jalen. His head snapped up. The man standing in front of him was tall, his posture straight and commanding. He wore a tailored suit, the kind Jalen had only seen in magazines, and his watch gleamed under the fluorescent lights. His face was sharp, but there was something familiar about him, something that made the hairs on Jalen's arms stand on end. Jalen frowned. "Sorry, do I know you?" The man smiled slightly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Not yet, but you will. Mind if I sit?" Jalen hesitated, glancing at his textbooks, then back at the man. He didn't look like someone who had time for small talk. Something about him felt calculated, like he had come here for a purpose. Jalen nodded slowly, and the man slid into the seat across from him. The waitress passed by, but the man waved her off. His focus was entirely on Jalen. He leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. "I've been looking for you for a long time, Jalen." Jalen's stomach twisted. That didn't make any sense. No one looked for him. No one knew him except his professors and his coworkers at the campus bookstore. He studied the man carefully, but still nothing. No recognition. "Who are you?" The man exhaled slowly, as if the weight of his own words was something he had been carrying for years. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. A piece of paper, no, not paper. A dollar bill. Crumpled, slightly aged. Jalen stared at it, confused. Then the man turned it slightly, revealing faded ink in the corner. The initials JD. His initials. The world tilted slightly. Jalen blinked at the dollar, then at the man. His heartbeat hammered against his ribs. Couldn't be. It was impossible. He felt his body go stiff, memories flooding back like a storm. The cold night, the hungry stomach, the bus he had missed. The man outside the store. No way. Jalen's throat went dry. You're that guy." The man nodded, his gaze unwavering. "That guy was a long time ago. My name is Marcus now." Jalen barely heard him. He was still staring at the dollar bill like it was a ghost. He had given that money away without thinking that night. He had walked home in the cold, convincing himself it didn't matter, convincing himself he had done the right thing. And now here was this man holding onto that moment like it had been the most important thing in his life. Why did you keep that?" Marcus's lips twitched slightly. "Because that night changed everything." Jalen had no words. His mind was still trying to bridge the gap between the desperate man outside the store and the polished businessman sitting across from him. It didn't make sense. People didn't just turn their lives around like that. Not from $1. Marcus leaned back in his seat, watching Jalen carefully. "You don't believe me." "It's not that," Jalen said slowly. "It's just, I don't understand." Marcus nodded as if he expected that. "Then let me explain." The diner felt smaller, somehow the air heavier. Jalen could only listen as Marcus spoke, his voice low, steady. "After you gave me that dollar, I bought food with it instead of drugs for the first time in years. Something about that moment stuck with me. I kept thinking about you, this kid who had nothing but still gave anyway. It made me realize how far I had fallen. I checked myself into a shelter the next day. Got into rehab. Spent years fighting my way back." Jalen swallowed hard. He didn't know what to say. He had spent all these years wondering if that man had survived, and here he was, thriving. Marcus reached into his suit jacket, this time pulling out a checkbook. He flipped it open casually, like this was just another business deal. Jalen's breath caught as Marcus's pen glided across the paper. The number was too many digits, too much. Marcus tore the check from the book and slid it across the table. "This covers your tuition. Every cent." Jalen stared. His hands refused to move. The check sat there, real, tangible. "Why?" Jalen whispered. Marcus's gaze met his. "Because you invested in me first." The check sat on the table between them, a silent force pressing against Jalen's chest. The number on it blurred as his vision unfocused, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts at once. It was too much, too surreal. He had come to this diner expecting another night of stress, another night of staring at numbers that never added up, and now this. Jalen's fingers twitched, but he didn't reach for it. His voice felt distant when he finally spoke. "I can't take this." Marcus didn't move. His face remained unreadable, but his eyes held something deeper, something unshakable. "Why not?" Jalen let out a breath that felt like it had been trapped in his lungs for hours. "Because this doesn't happen." Because nobody just walks into a diner and hands out a check like this. Because I don't even know you. Marcus nodded slowly as if he had expected this response. His fingers drummed lightly against the table. That's fair. But let me ask you something, Jalen. When you gave me that $1, did you know me? Jalen opened his mouth, then closed it. His chest tightened. No. And yet you gave it to me anyway. Jalen swallowed hard, looking away. That was different. Was it? The question lingered heavy in the air between them. Jalen didn't have an answer. He had spent years thinking about that night, wondering if it had mattered, wondering if it had changed anything. Now he knew it had. It had changed everything. Marcus leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. I spent a long time trying to figure out how to repay what you did for me. $1 doesn't seem like much to most people, but to me that night it was hope. It was proof that the world wasn't completely indifferent to me, that I wasn't invisible. Jalen felt his throat tighten. He had never thought about it like that. To him it had been a small act of kindness, nothing more. But to Marcus it had been a lifeline. I took that $1 and I made a promise. Marcus's voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, like he was speaking words he had carried for years. If I ever made it out, if I ever had the chance to change someone's life the way mine had been changed, I would do it. And here we are. Jalen's gaze dropped to the check again. The weight of what was happening settled over him like an avalanche. He had spent so long feeling like the world was against him, like no matter how hard he worked he would always be stuck. And now here was a man offering him freedom. A man he had helped without even realizing it. His hands clenched into fists. There was a part of him that wanted to take it without question. But there was another part, a deeper part, that was afraid. Afraid that accepting this meant owing something. Afraid that it wasn't real. What if I can't pay you back? Marcus's expression softened. Then don't. Jalen's eyes snapped up. What? You don't owe me anything. Marcus gestured toward the check. This isn't a loan, Jalen. It's an investment. Jalen shook his head. But what if I fail? What if I take this money and it all falls apart anyway? Then it falls apart. But at least you had a chance to fight for it. The words hit him harder than he expected. All his life Jalen had felt like he was clawing his way uphill, trying to prove he deserved to be here, trying to prove he was worth something. No one had ever handed him a chance. No one had ever believed in him enough to do something like this. He exhaled slowly. What happens after this? That's up to you, Marcus said. But I have a feeling you won't waste it. Jalen stared at the check for another long moment before finally reaching out. His fingers brushed against the paper. Felt real. Solid. He picked it up. The world didn't shift. The ground didn't shake. But something inside him changed. Marcus smiled. Good choice. Jalen let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. So what now? Marcus stood, smoothing out his suit. Now you finish what you started. And one day when the time comes you do the same for someone else. Jalen watched him for a moment, then nodded. Yeah, I will. As Marcus walked out of the diner, Jalen looked down at the check one last time. Then he folded it carefully, tucking it into his pocket. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't just surviving. He was moving forward. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel to support more powerful storytelling like this. And don't stop there. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next video. We'd also love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below to let us know how this story impacted you or what you'd like to see next. Your feedback helps us create meaningful content that connects with you. Thank you for being a part of our community. Your voice matters.